The afternoon light over the Solomon Islands was fierce and white, the kind that bleaches the ocean below into something almost unreal. From above 3,000 feet, Guadalcanal looked like it had been dropped into the Pacific by accident. A dark ridge of jungle pressing down toward a thin strip of coastline, and on that coastline, a crude airfield scratched out of the mud by Japanese laborers and then seized, almost overnight, by American Marines. It was the 26th of August, 1942, and two men, separated by 12,000 miles of ocean, by language, by empire, by every circumstance of birth, were climbing toward the same patch of sky. One of them would not come home. If you enjoy deeply researched stories like this, please consider subscribing. There are many more ahead, and each one takes weeks of work to bring to you. The man in the American cockpit was a 26-year-old Marine lieutenant from a dairy farm outside Hubbard, Oregon. His name was Marion Eugene Carl, and he had grown up learning to fix things: engines, fence lines, the stubborn machinery of a farm that never quite cooperated. He had soloed an airplane after only 2.5 hours of instruction, a figure so unusual that it became something of a legend at his flight school. By the time the war found him, Carl had already flown through the catastrophe at Midway, where fully half his squadron had been killed in a single morning. He had come away from that fight with one confirmed kill and a sober, quiet understanding of what survival actually required. The man in the Japanese cockpit was 24 years old, the son of a Navy captain, born in Tokyo on the 13th of February, 1918. His name was Junichi Sasai. He had been a sickly child, bullied at school, and had forged himself into something else entirely through years of judo and strict discipline. His classmates at the Imperial Naval Academy at Adajima, Japan's most prestigious officer training school, set on an island in the inland sea near Hiroshima, had called him Shamo, the Gamecock, because of his refusal to accept defeat. He wore a tiger head belt buckle, a gift from his father, and in his sleeping quarters he kept an image of Minamoto no Yoshitsune, the legendary 12th century warrior whose greatest quality was not strength but cunning. By the summer of 1942, Sasai was already one of the finest fighter pilots in the Imperial Japanese Navy, a squadron leader in the Tainan Kokutai, the Tainan Air Group, arguably the most accomplished naval fighter unit Japan had ever fielded. His score stood at 27 confirmed aerial victories. He commanded the admiration of pilots who were themselves among the deadliest aviators alive, men like Saburo Sakai and Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, both of whom would become legends in their own right. To his subordinates, Sasai was not merely skilled. He was genuinely beloved, an officer who took a personal interest in the enlisted pilots beneath him at a time when the Japanese Navy's rigid caste system actively discouraged such familiarity. He was, in almost every measurable respect, at the height of his powers. But to understand what happened on the 26th of August 1942, you need to understand something about the world both men had been living in and how different those worlds actually were. For the Americans on Guadalcanal, the summer of 1942 was a season lived entirely on the edge of collapse. The Marines of the Cactus Air Force, named for Guadalcanal's operational codename, were operating under conditions that would have been considered inadequate even for a rear-echelon training facility. Henderson Field, the airstrip they were defending, had been seized from the Japanese in early August while it was still under construction. Its surface was compacted coral and dirt, which became a churned swamp in heavy rain and a choking dust cloud in the heat. Mechanics worked through the night by flashlight to keep airplanes flying that had no business being airworthy. Replacement parts, fuel, ammunition, all of it arrived in unpredictable trickles. Some days the Wildcats were grounded simply because there was no aviation gasoline left on the island. The pilots slept in tents or makeshift shelters, ate whatever could be brought in by whatever transport happened to be available, and flew 2, 3, sometimes 4 scrambles a day. They were chronically tired, many of them running fevers from the jungle diseases that plagued the island: malaria, dysentery, a suite of infections for which the word tropical does not adequately convey the misery. The warning system they depended on was a network of Australian coast watchers, civilian volunteers and government officers hiding in the jungle on surrounding islands, who would radio in sightings of Japanese formations heading south. The margin of warning those coast watchers provided, sometimes as little as 20 or 30 minutes, was often the only reason the Wildcats managed to scramble to altitude before the Japanese arrived overhead. Marion Carl had landed on that island just 6 days before August 26. He had arrived on August 20th, part of the first fighter unit ashore with the Cactus Air Force. In the time between his arrival and the morning of August 24th, he had already downed 5 Japanese aircraft, making him officially the first United States Marine Corps ace of the Second World War. For the Japanese, the situation was almost a mirror image, but the asymmetry lay not in the quality of the men or the machines, but in the distances involved. The Tainan Kokutai flew its missions from Rabaul, the great Japanese naval base on the island of New Britain. Rabaul to Henderson Field was approximately 650 statute miles. 650 miles there, a battle over the target, and 650 miles back. At the throttle settings required to cover that kind of range, the Zeros were already near the limit of their endurance before a single shot was fired. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was, by 1942, still among the most capable fighter aircraft in the world, faster than the Grumman F4F Wildcat, more maneuverable at low speeds, capable of extraordinary range for a single-engine fighter of its era. Its great wingspan and light construction gave it a turning radius that American pilots had learned, at considerable cost, never to attempt to match in a direct turning engagement. But those same qualities that made the Zero exceptional came at a price that was becoming harder and harder to pay. The aircraft had been designed with almost no armor protection for the pilot and no self-sealing fuel tanks. Engineering decisions made in deliberate pursuit of performance and range. A single burst of American .50 caliber machine gun fire, if it found the Zero's unprotected fuel cells, could turn the aircraft into a fireball in seconds. The Wildcat, by contrast, was built like a tank by comparison, heavier, slower, less agile, but armored behind the pilot, equipped with self-sealing tanks, and capable of absorbing damage that would have been instantly fatal to the Zero. At Rabaul, those long missions were already taking their toll on the Tainan Kokutai in ways that went beyond simple aircraft losses. The base was plagued by the same tropical diseases that were grinding down the Americans on Guadalcanal, but without the DDT insecticide treatments that American forces had begun to deploy. Pilots who had started the war as experienced, well-rested professionals were now flying on accumulated fatigue, some of them quietly managing malarial fevers between sorties. Rabaul's pilots had taken to calling it the fighter pilot graveyard, not only for the combat, but for everything else the island seemed designed to take from a man. And unlike their American counterparts, Japanese naval aviators operated under a system that kept them in combat until they were killed, captured, or physically incapacitated. There was no formal rotation home after a set number of missions, no mandatory rest tour. You flew until you could not. On the afternoon of August 7, 1942, less than 3 weeks before the engagement that concerns us, Sasai had said goodbye to Saburo Sakai, who was being evacuated to Japan after being badly wounded during air combat over Guadalcanal. The injury had come in the most painful possible way. Sakai, one of the Navy's finest pilots and Sasai's closest colleague in the squadron, had mistaken a formation of American torpedo bombers for fighters and flown directly into their defensive fire. He had taken a bullet that passed through the top of his head, destroying most of the vision in one eye and leaving him in agony across the 900-mile flight back to Rabaul. He survived through a feat of will that has been written about many times and is difficult to fully credit even as historical fact. Before Sakai was carried onto the transport that would take him to Japan for surgery, Sasai had visited him at his bedside. He placed his tiger head belt buckle, his most personal possession, the one his father had given him, into Sakai's hand. "Please go back to Japan," he told him. "And please come back to Rabaul." Sakai never saw Sasai again. It is worth pausing here to consider what the Tainan Kokutai had already lost by August of 1942, and what that loss meant for the men still flying. The unit had been the sharpest instrument Japan possessed in the air at the beginning of the Pacific War. Its pilots had cut through Allied air power in the Philippines, over Malaya, through the Dutch East Indies, and across New Guinea with a lethality that had seemed almost supernatural to the men on the receiving end. They had flown more hours, in more combat, over more ocean, than almost any unit in the history of naval aviation to that point. But war has a way of consuming its best instruments fastest. Every mission over Guadalcanal took a little more from the men flying it. Every pilot lost was a pilot whose experience could not be replaced overnight, or even over months. Japan had no system, had never built a system, for cycling its most experienced aviators out of frontline duty and into training commands, where their knowledge might be multiplied across dozens of newer pilots. The Americans were beginning to do exactly that. Japan was not. Sasai understood this, at least intuitively. He had watched the war's appetite grow. By the 26th of August, 1942, he was not the same pilot who had arrived at Rabaul months before with the easy confidence of a man who had never been given a real reason to doubt himself. He was a man who had flown 75 combat sorties, who had buried colleagues and sent others home broken. He was still, by any objective measure, one of the finest fighter pilots alive. But the margin for error that every living aviator carries within himself, the invisible reserve of calm that keeps a man's hands steady when everything is happening at once, had been drawn down by months of cumulative strain in ways that no amount of skill could entirely compensate for. On the morning of August 26th, Sasai led 80 south from Rabaul, escorting a formation of Mitsubishi G4M Betty medium bombers bound for Henderson Field. It was his 76th sortie with the Tainan Kokutai. The mission profile was familiar, almost routine, the long overwater crossing at altitude, the coast of Guadalcanal appearing on the horizon, the descent toward the target, and then the chaos of whatever the Americans had managed to scramble to meet them. Down on Henderson Field, the Coast Watcher network had done its job. Word of an inbound Japanese formation had reached the field with enough lead time for the Wildcats of VMF 223 to get airborne. Marion Carl had climbed into his F4F4, strapped himself in, and taxied out of the dispersal area. The Wildcat was not a graceful machine on the ground. It sat high on its landing gear, wide and squat, its radial engine filling the nose with a kind of aggressive purposefulness. He pushed the throttle forward, and the Pratt & Whitney Twin Wasp delivered its 1,200 horsepower, and the Wildcat lurched forward and climbed. Carl had a particular quality that set him apart from many pilots of equal technical skill. He seemed constitutionally incapable of panic. The men who flew with him remembered it later. Not a recklessness, not an absence of fear, but something more useful than either. A capacity to process incoming information in the middle of a fight and respond to it as though time were moving more slowly for him than for everyone else. It had been there at Midway, when 15 of the 25 fighters his squadron put into the air that morning had been destroyed, and he had come back with 1 kill and both landing gear intact. It had been there in the engagements since. It would be there now. The Japanese formation crossed the northern coast of Guadalcanal and came under fire. The American Wildcats had altitude, the Coast Watchers had given them that much, and they used it the way their tactics demanded. Diving through the Japanese formation, pressing the attack at high speed where the Zero's low-speed maneuverability was neutralized, and pulling away before the lighter Japanese fighters could turn inside them. What happened next is reconstructed from the accounts of American pilots, the wreckage on the ground, and the Japanese records that survived the war. Sasai, leading the escort formation, moved to engage an F4F Wildcat he spotted descending toward Henderson Field. Likely an American pilot who had already made his attack pass and was pulling back toward the airfield and its protective curtain of anti-aircraft fire. The Wildcat moved toward that curtain of flak, seeking its shelter. The Zero gave chase. It was a reasonable tactical decision, the kind a confident pilot with 27 victories makes on instinct. He had done it before. He knew how Wildcats flew, knew their limitations. He went in from above. But the American pilot, almost certainly Marion Carl, based on the timing and the position of his claimed kill that afternoon, did not do what logic suggested he should do. Instead of running for the cover of the anti-aircraft guns in a straight line, he performed a maneuver that required the kind of cold nerve that is difficult to teach. He pulled his nose into a near-vertical climb, turning back toward the Zero that was pressing him from above, and opened fire. It was, by any reasonable calculation, an all-or-nothing gamble. If his aim was off by even a small margin, if his timing was wrong, if the Zero turned away fast enough, he would be giving a superior aircraft the angle it needed to kill him. He had, in that moment, committed himself entirely. He did not miss. The Zero's fuel tank, unarmored, unsealed, carrying whatever fuel remained after more than 600 miles of flying, received a burst of 50 caliber machine gun fire. The tank ignited. The aircraft came apart in the air above the beach, pieces of it scattering across the sand of Guadalcanal in full view of hundreds of Marines watching from the ground below. Lieutenant Junior Grade Junichi Sasai, 24 years old, the Flying Tiger of the Tainan Kokutai, holder of 27 confirmed aerial victories, died instantly. He was posthumously promoted 2 full grades to lieutenant commander by the Imperial Japanese Navy, a recognition reserved for aviators who had distinguished themselves beyond ordinary measure. Marion Carl did not know, in that moment, who he had killed. The fight was still going on around him. There were still aircraft to track, still altitude to manage, still decisions to make. He would not learn the identity of the pilot inside that Zero for some time. Down on Henderson Field, hundreds of Marines had watched it happen. That was, perhaps, the most unusual quality of this particular kill. It had witnesses. Not the guarded, reconstructed testimony of pilots comparing notes in a debriefing room, but the unguarded reaction of ground crews and infantrymen who had looked up from whatever they were doing at the sound of the overhead fight, and watched a Zero disintegrate above the beach in a shower of burning debris. The pieces fell into the sand. Men who had spent weeks absorbing Japanese air raids with little more than foxholes and prayers had stood and cheered. Marion Carl landed his Wildcat, taxied to dispersal, and climbed out. He was 26 years old. He had just shot down what he reported as a single Zero, his 5th kill in 2 days of fighting over the island, pushing his total to 7 confirmed aerial victories and making him, officially, the first ace in the history of the United States Marine Corps. He did not yet know the name of the man inside that Zero. If you found this story worth your time, please consider hitting that subscribe button. Stories like this one take weeks of research to build, and your support makes all of it possible. The name would not emerge clearly until much later, pieced together from Japanese records, survivor accounts, and the painstaking post-war research of aviation historians working to reconcile American claims with Japanese losses. But the weight of the evidence, the timing of the engagement, the position of Sasai's formation, the pattern of Japanese losses recorded for that day, points consistently toward the same conclusion. The wreckage that fell onto the beach at Guadalcanal on the afternoon of August 26, 1942 almost certainly contained the remains of Lieutenant Junior Grade Junichi Sasai, the most decorated fighter pilot in the Tainan Kokutai, a man who had spent the better part of a year becoming the sharpest aerial weapon Japan possessed in the South Pacific. The Imperial Japanese Navy acknowledged his death. They posthumously promoted him 2 full ranks to lieutenant commander, a distinction awarded to aviators of exceptional distinction, not a bureaucratic formality. In Japan, Sasai was mourned as a genuine hero of the nation. His name appeared in newspapers. His photograph circulated. He was, in the language of the time and the culture that produced him, a man who had fulfilled his obligation completely. None of which meant anything to the man who had killed him, who spent that evening eating whatever provisions Henderson Field's supply chain had managed to scrape together that week, sleeping on a cot in a tent, listening to the jungle sounds outside, and preparing to do it all again the next morning. That asymmetry, the profound gap between how the same event is experienced on opposing sides of a war, is one of the things that makes this story worth examining carefully. Sasai was a name, a face, a person known and grieved by his colleagues. To Carl and the Marines of the Cactus Air Force, the kill was a tally mark. Not out of callousness, these were not callous men, but simply because the pace and circumstances of combat at Guadalcanal in the late summer of 1942 did not permit the luxury of individual reckoning. There were too many aircraft coming too often for any pilot to know or care who was inside the one he had just shot down. You identified the type, you reported the kill, you landed, you refueled, you went back up. It is worth understanding what the loss of Sasai actually meant to the Tainan Kokutai beyond the personal grief of the men who had known him. A fighter unit's effectiveness is not measured purely by the number of airframes it can put into the sky. It is measured by the accumulated experience, judgment, and institutional knowledge carried inside the heads of its pilots. Knowledge that cannot be replaced by requisitioning new airplanes from a depot. When Sasai died, the Tainan Kokutai lost something that could not be rebuilt from parts. It lost a commander who had flown 76 combat sorties, who understood the specific demands of the 650-mile round trip to Guadalcanal in a way that only those missions could teach, who knew how to read a developing engagement from the moment a formation was first spotted, and who commanded the loyalty and confidence of his men in the particular way that only genuine competence can inspire. The losses did not stop with Sasai. Between August and November of 1942, the Tainan Kokutai lost 32 pilots killed in action over and around Guadalcanal. 32. By the time the campaign ground into its final phase and the Japanese began the painful process of evacuating their surviving forces from the island in early 1943, the unit that had entered the war as perhaps the finest naval fighter group Japan had ever assembled had been reduced to a remnant of between 10 and 20 surviving pilots, depending on which historical account you consult. On the 1st of November, 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy formally disbanded the Tainan Kokutai and redesignated it as the 251st Air Group, reconstituted with replacement aircrew who had a fraction of the flying hours and a fraction of the combat experience of the men they replaced. The 20 or so pilots who survived the original unit were transferred back to Japan, where their hard-won expertise was desperately needed to train the next generation of naval aviators. It was, by any dispassionate analysis, too little, too late. Japan had never built the institutional infrastructure necessary to extract full value from its experienced men before the war consumed them. The Americans had begun to do the opposite, rotating their best pilots home after extended combat tours, placing them in training commands where their knowledge could be multiplied across hundreds of students. It was not a glamorous use of an ace's abilities, and many of the pilots rotated out of combat resented it fiercely. But it was strategically sound in a way that Japan's approach was not, and the consequences of that difference would compound with brutal arithmetic across the remaining years of the war. The campaign for Guadalcanal, when it finally ended with the Japanese evacuation completed on the 9th of February 1943, had cost the Imperial Japanese Navy over 600 aircraft and, far more critically, over 1,200 experienced pilots and aircrew members who could not be replaced with anything approaching their equivalent. The Americans had suffered significant losses too, but they were losses that an industrial power of the United States scale and a training system of its depth could absorb and recover from. Japan could not. The attrition over Guadalcanal's skies in those 6 months of 1942 and early 1943 was not simply a tactical defeat. It was the beginning of the structural collapse of Japanese naval air power, a process that would accelerate through the Solomons Campaign of 1943, reach its catastrophic conclusion at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944. The engagement American pilots would dryly call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot and never reverse itself. Junichi Sasai was 24 years old when he died. He had come from everything the Imperial Japanese Navy valued most: discipline, family tradition, the exacting culture of Etajima, the relentless self-improvement of a man who had been told since childhood that the only acceptable response to adversity was to make himself harder. He had done all of it. He had become exactly what his system asked him to become. And then the system sent him 650 miles to fight over an island that Japan could not hold, against an opponent whose industrial capacity and pilot training pipeline would eventually prove as overwhelming as any weapon ever deployed in war. Marion Carl, for his part, did not leave Guadalcanal a changed man in any dramatic, visible sense. He was not the type. He continued flying. On September 9, 1942, 2 weeks after the engagement with Sasai, he was shot down in aerial combat off the coast of Guadalcanal, forced to bail out of his badly damaged Wildcat, and spent 5 days struggling to swim against the tide toward shore. He was eventually pulled from the water by Solomon Islanders in a canoe and returned to Henderson Field. He went back up. By the time VMF 223 departed the island on the 16th of October, 1942, Carl had accumulated 16.5 aerial victories, second among all Marine Corps pilots at the time, behind only his squadron commander, Major John Smith, who had 19. When a general informed Carl of Smith's lead and asked what to do about it, Carl's response was, by all accounts, entirely in character. "God damn it, General," he said. "Ground him for 5 days." The post-war life of Marion Carl was, in its own way, as improbable as his wartime record. He never stopped pushing against the edge of what was possible. In August of 1947, flying the Douglas D-558I Skystreak at Muroc Army Airfield in California, he set a new world airspeed record of 650 miles per hour, a figure that had seemed almost mythological just a few years before, when the Wildcat's top speed of 330 miles per hour had represented the practical ceiling of what a naval fighter could do. 2 months later, Air Force Captain Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier in the Bell X-1 and eclipsed Carl's record. But the fact that Carl had held it at all was a measure of how completely he had absorbed the transition from propeller to jet that left many of his generation behind. In 1953, he set a world altitude record of 83,235 feet in the Douglas D-558-2 Skyrocket. He commanded the 1st Marine Corps Jet Fighter Squadron. He flew reconnaissance missions over the People's Republic of China in the mid-1950s. He led Marine forces ashore in Vietnam. He retired as a Major General in 1973 with 13,000 flying hours and a chest full of decorations that took more than a few seconds to read through, including a Navy Cross with 2 gold stars and a Distinguished Flying Cross with 4 gold stars. He went home to Oregon, to the North Umpqua River near Roseburg, to the landscape he had grown up with. He and his wife Edna, they had married in January of 1943, a few months after Guadalcanal, settled along the river and enjoyed the life that the war had not taken from them. In 1994, he published his memoir, co-authored with the aviation writer Barrett Tillman, under the title Pushing the Envelope. It is a matter-of-fact book, as you would expect from a matter-of-fact man, clear, precise, and notably free of the retrospective mythologizing that characterizes some accounts of the air war in the Pacific. On the night of June 28, 1998, a 19-year-old drifter named Jesse Fainus broke into the Carl home in Douglas County, armed with a stolen shotgun. He had, by his own later account to police, chosen the house because he wanted a car and did not want to walk to Roseburg. Marion Carl, 82 years old, placed himself between the intruder and his wife. He was shot and killed. Edna was grazed by a bullet but survived. The man who had survived Midway survived being shot down twice over Guadalcanal, survived hundreds of combat missions across 3 wars, survived the transition to jet aircraft at a time when test pilots were dying at a rate that made combat look modest by comparison, was killed by a teenager who wanted a car. Fainus was apprehended several days later in Southern California. He was convicted of aggravated murder in April of 1999 and eventually sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Marion Carl was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. The airport serving the city of Roseburg was renamed Marion Carl Field. His Navy Cross citation hangs in the National Museum of Naval Aviation in Pensacola. The National Aviation Hall of Fame, upon his enshrinement, published a memorial that contained a line precise enough to be worth repeating in substance. Marion Carl departed life in the same way he had lived it, heroically. There is something in that to sit with for a moment. 2 men had climbed toward the same patch of sky on an August afternoon in 1942, over an island that neither of them had any particular reason to care about before the war made it the most important piece of real estate in the South Pacific. One of them had been raised to believe that the measure of a life was how fully it was sacrificed in service of something larger than itself, that death in combat, willingly met, was not a failure but a completion. He had given everything the system asked of him and received in return a posthumous promotion, a newspaper obituary, and a grief that his closest colleagues carried for the rest of their lives. The tiger head belt buckle his father had given him, left with a wounded friend on a transport to Japan, was all that remained. The other had been raised on a dairy farm in Oregon, had learned to fly because he could, and had fought because the times demanded it of him, not with any particular ideology or any particular rage, but with the quiet, efficient competence of a man who understood that the job in front of him needed doing well. He had survived everything. He had gone faster than almost any human being alive. He had lived long enough to sit by a river in Oregon and write a book about it all, and then, at 82 years old, he had stepped in front of a shotgun to protect his wife. The history of the Second World War is full of grand narratives. The turning of tides, the industrial equations that sealed the outcome years before the last shot was fired, the strategic decisions made in conference rooms that determined the fates of millions. But inside those grand narratives are individual encounters of a few seconds' duration, in which 2 human beings moving at several hundred miles per hour try simultaneously to kill each other and survive, and one of them succeeds. Those seconds are irreducible. They cannot be explained away by industrial output or training doctrine or the length of supply lines, even though all of those things contributed to the conditions that produced them. In those seconds, the war was personal in a way it almost never was at any other scale. Junichi Sasai's Zero came apart over the beach at Guadalcanal on a Tuesday afternoon in August, before witnesses who cheered and did not know his name. Marion Carl landed, climbed out, and was already thinking about what came next. The war had 57 months still to run. There was a great deal more sky to cross. If you made it to the end of the story, it means a great deal. Please share it with someone who loves history, and consider subscribing so you never miss another one.